At first glance, the canon and its associated questions and discussions seem to be losing significance in the discourse and practice of art history. At least I have the impression at universities. After a period of explicit, sometimes highly controversial canon criticism, we seem to have entered a situation in which the canon hardly shapes everyday practice anymore and is increasingly becoming the subject of historical retrospection. At the same time, the discipline has expanded its scope to such an extent that it seems impossible to think of a comprehensive canon, which would now also have to consider non-European art and perhaps non-artistic images and artifacts. The limited, rigid canon seems to have been replaced by an almost inexhaustible abundance of human creations. Moreover, a canon seems more dispensable than ever, since art historical research increasingly legitimizes itself by addressing specific questions and no longer only through the supposed dignity of its objects. In many cases, the question no longer arises as to whether an object has the status of an artwork or is a masterpiece. This impression seems to be confirmed by a thesis currently being elaborated on in a large interdisciplinary research project. At the University of Siegen in North Rhine-Westphalia, a group of media, cultural, and social scholars investigates the assumption that a fundamental shift in evaluation practices can be observed in Western societies over the last 50 years. In particular, the field of culture is increasingly less organized around the guiding difference of high versus low culture or serious art versus entertainment. What is decisive now is rather the question of what attracts attention. In other words, what is popular and binds large groups of recipients or consumers. It is no longer the quality judgment of a few respected critics that makes the decisive difference, but the success with the public. This hypothesis could be reformulated as follows: the canon is more and more being replaced by rankings based on the measurement of success in attracting attention. This situation is probably why many art historians feel as I do. For a long time, I had the impression that I was not concerned with questions of the canon. In my understanding, I did not work on Giovanni Bellini or on Caspar David Friedrich because they had painted masterpieces, but because they provided me with adequate examples to discuss more general questions, perhaps, for instance, about our understanding of pictures and about the temporality of seeing a question I'm particularly interested in. And yet, the canon, with all its problems, finally forced itself upon me. It is perhaps no coincidence that a preoccupation with the canon became inevitable for me when I had to reflect, in a very practical sense, on the foundations of our discipline. A few years ago at Bielefeld University, where I was teaching at the time, the opportunity arose to establish an independent course of study in art history for the first time. From the beginning, it was clear that the number of teachers and thus the ranges of courses would be severely limited. It was therefore necessary to design a curriculum that would guarantee the best possible introduction to our discipline, despite a quite reduced number of courses. At the center of this study program, entitled Art History and Historical Image Studies, is the teaching of basic cross-epochal practices and methods of describing and analyzing pictures. In addition, the focus on general theoretical questions shapes the profile of the program. However, it was also important to consider the expectations that students and future employers would have of the degree program. We decided to impart significant elements of the general knowledge that is overall expected from a study of art history with the help of an e-learning tool. The selection of approximately 500 exemplary objects, supplemented by another 100 objects from regional art history, is to be memorized with the help of a digital database and a playful e-learning program. The course is intended to impart general visual knowledge that serves as an orientation for students to become familiar with works of art, the knowledge of which could later help to classify hitherto unknown objects, at least roughly. Such a learning unit inevitably implies the need for selection. What is sufficiently exemplary, significant, or relevant? Even if one does not want to base this selection on criteria of quality, and even if one avoids a designation as canon, it is noticeable that a large part of those questions arises again around which the debates about the canon always revolve. My example might indicate that our discipline cannot escape the curse and fascination of the canon, which helps to grasp something like the common core of the discipline, or horribile dictu, its identity. Incidentally, this is precisely one of the essential functions of canons in general. They mark points of reference at which the identity of groups can emerge and stabilize. Through exemplary works or objects, the respective canon embodies values, norms, and attributions of meaning. Above all, however, they secure the internal communication of the group, since the common canonical references counteract the disintegration into unconnected subgroups. This is precisely where the abysmal ambivalence of the canon lies. For what it decisively helps to secure the identity and common orientation of a group is self highly ambivalent and associated with exclusion and hierarchization that cause discomfort with good reason. One of the problematic effects of the formation of canons is the perpetuation of exclusion and marginalization due to merely contingent circumstances, as they heavily rely on historical and cultural factors. The classical canon of traditional art history testifies to this in many ways. To mention only one example, even in times when women had more and more access to art production, it was still possible to persistently marginalize them because the canon seemed to prove that art was a field of activity for men. In general, the canon of art allows us to observe the perpetuating momentum of marginalization and exclusion. Entire genres, techniques, materials, genders, regions, continents, and religious communities remained at best marginal to this canon. The numerous attempts to revise or expand the canon have changed this situation, but for their part, they always run the risk to unleash comparable dynamics of their own. Even a modified or yet fundamentally newly conceived canon finds itself afflicted with a problem that it can make individual choices or group decisions appear like a reproduction of supposedly natural conditions. Pierre Bourdieu has described this effect succinctly. To quote him, every established order tends to produce the naturalization of its own arbitrariness. In this way, the establishment of norms leads to normalization. This effect results not least from the fact that the canon implies orientation for individual choices and behaviors, for example, by influencing the ways cultural events, works, and institutions are perceived. The attributions of value, relevance, or significance incorporated in the canon appear like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Quite often, they prove true as they actually provoke a direction and accumulation of attention. In such cases, the canon additionally stabilizes itself through the circularity of the attribution of meaning. All these problems inherent in the canon can hardly be eliminated or even mastered by its reflection, revision, or expansion. Attempts to rethink the traditional European Western canons of art, literature, music, etc. on a global level and to expand them in order to include non-European positions raise additional questions. If carried out very decisively and thoroughly, such an attempt could promote the post-colonial provincialization of Europe called for by Dipesh Chakrabarti, among others. For example, such a project could demonstrate that early modern panel painting is not the sole culmination of the production of human artifacts. It can, however, equally have the consequence that with a canon, a problematic, generally European figure of thought or form of knowledge organization is globalized in a, as it were, hidden colonial act. Let us return to the latent importance of the canon for the discipline of art history. At the beginning, I expressed the impression that the canon has lost considerable importance in everyday practice. Although I have outlined there are reasons for not considering the canon question to be settled entirely, the impression of a continuing loss of importance seems to me to be quite correct. However, this loss of importance is not only an expression of a laboriously achieved polyphony, polyperspectivity, and dismantling of hierarchies. The dwindling relevance of the canon is, like the canon itself, rather deeply ambivalent. The loss of relevance of the canon can also be understood as a symptom of a creeping crisis of a discipline that runs the risk of disintegrating into particular individual discourses which are hardly connected anymore. The situations in which we seriously bring the sub-areas of our discipline into a profound and in-depth conversation with one another seem, as it appears to me, to be becoming fewer and fewer. Where do experts of early Middle Ages and global contemporary art, or of the altarpiece of the Renaissance and digital visualization in the natural sciences actually meet and interact in scholarly discourse? Therefore, it should come as no surprise that art history is being taught in increasingly diverse ways at universities around the world, and that some universities and institutions are developing ever more independent and perhaps at times idiosyncratic educational profiles. At present, the centrifugal forces probably clearly outweigh the centering tendencies. But the question arises whether we can omit a certain, albeit flexible, basic stock of reference works to which we can refer in our exchange with others. Are specific practices, methods, and theories alone sufficient to keep the entire discipline in conversation, or might not the shared knowledge of certain exemplary objects continue to be helpful? In our discipline in particular, this question is not just a purely academic discussion. Unlike, for example, in literary studies, in art history, the canon also contributes to the practice of certain elementary skills, especially the classification and attribution of works of art. Those who have a good knowledge of the canon can, of course, not immediately claim connoisseurship, but at least they have a basis for orienting themselves in the diversity of art historical tradition. Moreover, it might also be worth discussing whether hierarchization and exclusion can become even more effective and persistent if we are no longer even aware of them by discussing a canon. The impression that we have overcome an earlier phase in which our discipline clung to a canon could fatally contribute to perpetuating unwritten and implicit attributions of value all the more strongly. After all, the canon has long since left its deep traces in the discipline's collective memory, and we are barred from returning to a supposed tabula rasa, to an innocent 0 point. It may be that the canon is, in any case, not so much a cause as a symptom of art history's problems, so that ignoring the symptom would not alter the fact that its cause persists. As long as the canon remains, latent hierarchies and exclusions stay visible and can thus be criticized and attacked. If this assumption is not completely wrong, the problem would not be the canon, but rather our practice in dealing with it. But then, at least vaguely, a way would emerge as to how the discipline of art history could henceforth deal with the problem of the canon. The aim would not be a silent farewell to it, but rather its constant change and questioning. Therefore, we should perhaps discuss less whether we want to have a canon and how exactly it should be composed. Instead, it would be more important to think about practices of dealing with this question in such a way that the canon, or better yet, a plurality of canons, can be understood as a flexible, changeable crystallization point for thinking about the fundamental questions of our discipline. Thank you very much for your attention.